Welcome to Verified Whispers, where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blur into a terrifying landscape of cosmic horror. What you're about to hear are not mere stories, but fragments of forbidden knowledge that have driven men to the brink of madness. These are accounts that challenge everything we understand about our existence, tales that reveal the horrifying truth. We are nothing more than insignificant specks in an incomprehensible universe far darker and more ancient than our minds can possibly comprehend. For centuries, humanity has comforted itself with the illusion of understanding, with the belief that we are somehow special, somehow protected from the unimaginable terrors that lurk just beyond the thin veil of our perceived reality. But what if that veil is nothing more than a fragile illusion? What if every unexplained disappearance, every moment of inexplicable dread, every whispered legend carries within it a fragment of a truth so terrifying that to fully understand it would shatter your sanity? The stories I'm about to share are not for the faint of heart. They are meticulously researched accounts that defy explanation, testimonies from researchers, survivors, and witnesses who have glimpsed something fundamental about our universe. Knowledge that comes at the ultimate price of psychological destruction. These are not fabrications or mere urban legends. These are fragments of true encounters that suggest our reality is nothing more than a thin membrane stretched over an abyss of unimaginable horror. As you listen, remember, knowledge is a double-edged sword. Each story is a descent into madness, a journey that will challenge everything you believe about science, history, and the very nature of human existence. Some truths are better left undiscovered, some whispers better left unheard. But for those brave, or perhaps foolish, enough to listen, a terrifying journey awaits. Prepare yourself. The line between reality and nightmare is about to blur, and once crossed, there is no turning back. Dr. Elena Petrova never believed in supernatural explanations. As a leading Russian paleontologist with over 2 decades of Arctic research experience, she had built her entire career on scientific methodology, empirical evidence, and rational thought. Yet, nothing in her extensive training could have prepared her for the horror that emerged from the depths of the Siberian wilderness in the summer of 2018. The expedition had begun like countless others before it. A routine geological survey in the remote Yakutia region, focusing on potential fossil discoveries in the deep permafrost. Her team of 6 was carefully selected, each member a specialist in their respective fields. Vladimir, the geologist, had worked with Elena for years, his steady demeanor a constant source of comfort during their most challenging expeditions. Mikhail, their youngest team member, was a brilliant graduate student with an insatiable curiosity about prehistoric life. Anna, their lead technician, brought years of field experience and an uncanny ability to keep equipment functioning in the most brutal conditions. Their base camp was established in a relatively flat area surrounded by ancient pine forests, with the massive drilling equipment positioned to extract core samples from layers of permafrost that had remained undisturbed for millions of years. The initial days were uneventful, marked by the rhythmic sound of drilling and the meticulous logging of geological data. But on the 7th night, everything changed. It began with a subtle vibration, so minor that Vladimir initially dismissed it as wind or perhaps a distant avalanche. But the vibration grew, not in intensity, but in a way that defied natural explanation. It was a resonance that seemed to originate from deep beneath the earth, a rhythmic pulse that felt almost deliberate. The team's sophisticated seismic equipment showed no corresponding readings, which only deepened the growing sense of unease. Mikhail was the first to notice the change in the surrounding environment. The forest, typically alive with the sounds of wildlife, had gone completely silent. No bird calls, no rustling of small animals, not even the wind seemed to penetrate the absolute stillness. When he mentioned this to Elena, she initially attributed it to his inexperience, But deep down, she felt it too. A pressure, almost like a presence that was watching, waiting. The first physical evidence emerged during a core sample extraction. As the drill pushed deeper into layers that predated human civilization, something unexpected happened. The core sample, instead of being a continuous column of compressed earth and rock, contained an anomalous substance. It wasn't organic matter, nor was it strictly mineral. Under preliminary microscopic examination, the material seemed to possess a quality that defied conventional scientific classification. It seemed to pulse with an internal rhythm, almost like a living membrane. Anna's initial spectroscopic analysis revealed something even more disturbing. The molecular structure of the sample contained elements that shouldn't exist together, combinations that violated fundamental principles of chemistry. More alarmingly, the sample seemed to be changing. Microscopic observations showed subtle shifts in its internal structure, movements that suggested an impossible form of life, or something beyond life as they understood it. Vladimir began experiencing the first signs of what would later be described in fragmented field notes as cognitive dissonance. He would suddenly forget basic protocols, find himself staring into the distance with a vacant expression, and mumble phrases in a language no one could recognize. When questioned, he would have no memory of these episodes. His scientific mind, rejecting any suggestion of abnormality. The nightmares came next. Each team member began experiencing identical dream sequences, visions of vast, impossible cities buried deep beneath the permafrost, structures that defied Euclidean geometry, with angles that twisted and bent in ways that caused immediate migraines upon waking. In these dreams, they were always observed by entities, if they could be called entities, that were simultaneously everywhere and nowhere, their forms so alien that the human mind struggled to process their existence. Mikhail was the first to break. After a particularly vivid dream sequence, he began carving strange symbols into the research equipment, his hands moving with a precision that suggested he was merely a conduit for something else. When Elena tried to stop him, he turned, and in that moment she realized the person she knew as Mikhail was no longer present. Something else looked back at her, something ancient and utterly inhuman. By the time a rescue team arrived 2 weeks later, only Elena remained. The others had vanished, leaving behind equipment covered in those same impossible symbols. Her initial report was deemed hallucination, a result of extreme isolation and psychological stress. But Elena knew the truth. Something had been awakened. In those depths, something that had been waiting, watching, preparing. Years later, when asked about the expedition, Elena would only say one thing. Some discoveries are better left buried. But in the quiet moments, in the depths of night, she would wake up hearing that rhythmic pulse, feeling the weight of something vast and incomprehensible, stirring just beneath the surface of what we foolishly call reality. The Siberian wilderness kept its secrets. For now. Dr. James Holloway had dedicated his entire academic career to maritime archaeology, spending decades cataloging shipwrecks and maritime disasters. His reputation was built on meticulous research and an uncanny ability to piece together historical narratives from the most fragmented of sources. The Maritime Research Center in Copenhagen was his sanctuary, a place where thousands of forgotten logs, journals, and maritime records found their final resting place. It was during a routine archival reorganization in the summer of 2015 that he first encountered the collection that would ultimately destroy his sanity. The documents had been donated anonymously, sealed in a weathered leather portfolio that bore no markings beyond a series of strange, intricate symbols etched into its surface. Initial cataloging revealed the collection belonged to the personal archives of Captain Heinrich Reinhardt, a German maritime officer who had served during the early years of the 20th century. The first journal entry immediately struck Holloway as unusual. Unlike typical maritime logs filled with navigational details and routine observations, Reinhardt's writings read like a descent into madness. The early entries spoke of a routine naval expedition in the North Atlantic, a region Holloway knew well from countless historical studies. But something was different. The language was precise, almost clinical, yet underneath ran a current of mounting terror that became more palpable with each page. Reinhardt described an encounter that defied all rational explanation. His ship, a mid-sized naval vessel, had been conducting routine maritime surveys when they encountered a phenomenon that no scientific explanation could adequately describe. At first, it began with subtle changes in the ocean itself. The water seemed to develop an unnatural consistency, a viscosity that contradicted everything known about marine environments. Instruments began to malfunction in ways that suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the very fabric of reality around them. The captain's logs detailed strange acoustic phenomena. The crew reported hearing sounds that were not sounds, vibrations that seemed to originate from beneath the ocean, rhythmic pulses that resonated at frequencies impossible for human ears to comprehend. These were not the typical whale songs or geological rumbles that maritime researchers occasionally documented. These were something else entirely. Communications from something vast, ancient, and fundamentally alien. As Holloway continued reading, he discovered that not all crew members experienced these phenomena identically. Some became increasingly withdrawn, speaking in languages that did not exist, their eyes fixed on horizons that seemed to bend and twist in impossible ways. Others began to physically change. Reinhardt's descriptions were clinical yet horrifying. Subtle mutations, shifts in cellular structure that suggested the crew was being transformed by something beyond human comprehension. The most disturbing aspect of the documents was not their content, but their implications. Reinhardt's later entries suggested that what they had encountered was not an isolated incident. He wrote of historical records, ancient maritime legends from cultures across the globe that hinted at similar encounters. Civilizations that had spoken of entities dwelling in the deepest ocean trenches, beings that existed in dimensions humans could not perceive. Cryptic references suggested these entities were not simply unknown marine life. They were something more. Intelligence that predated human civilization, organisms that viewed our existence the way humans might view microscopic bacteria. Transient, irrelevant, utterly inconsequential. The final entries of the journal were fragmented, written in a hand that grew increasingly erratic. Reinhardt spoke of a convergence, a moment when the boundary between what we perceive as reality and something far more terrifying would become permeable. He wrote of cities beneath the waves, civilizations that had watched humanity's entire evolutionary journey with a detachment that bordered on contempt. Holloway's academic training fought against the implications of these documents. His rational mind sought explanations, mass hallucination, psychological breakdown, elaborate hoax. But something in the precision of Reinhardt's documentation, the consistency of the narrative, resisted such convenient dismissals. The true horror came when Holloway began cross-referencing the journal with other maritime records. Subtle correlations emerged. Unexplained ship disappearances. Zones in the ocean where navigation systems consistently failed. Regions where marine life seemed to follow patterns that defied biological understanding. As weeks turned into months, Holloway became obsessed. His colleagues noticed the change. He began to speak about the documents in hushed, urgent tones. His research took on a desperate quality, as if he were trying to warn the world about something lurking just beyond the thin membrane of human perception. Then, one night, everything changed. Colleagues found Holloway's office in a state of complete disarray. His research materials were meticulously organized, but Holloway himself had vanished. The only clue was a final note, written in a hand that was both precise and trembling. They are waiting, always waiting, beneath the waves. The Maritime Research Center quietly closed the investigation. The documents were sealed, classified, removed from public access. But for those who knew where to look, the truth remained. Something ancient and incomprehensible continues to watch, to wait, to observe humanity's brief, insignificant existence. The ocean keeps its secrets. For now. Dr. Rebecca Hartley had always been fascinated by genealogy, but not in the way most researchers approach the field. Where others saw family trees and historical connections, she saw something deeper, a complex tapestry of genetic memory, inherited trauma, and the dark threads that connect generations in ways science could never fully explain. The manuscript arrived unexpectedly, packaged in an antique leather binding that bore the unmistakable signs of age and preservation. Its provenance was unclear. A anonymous donation to the university's rare manuscripts department, with nothing but a cryptic note suggesting it had been passed through her family for generations. As the department's lead researcher specializing in generational studies, the package had been routed directly to her. Initial examination revealed something extraordinary. The manuscript was not a single document, but a collection of fragments, journals, letters, medical records, and what appeared to be scientific observations spanning nearly 2 centuries. The earliest entry dated back to 1823, written by a distant ancestor named Elizabeth Hartley, a woman whose name had been barely a whisper in family lore. Elizabeth's initial writings seemed mundane, typical correspondence of a woman from the early 19th century. But as Rebecca delved deeper, a disturbing pattern emerged. Each generation's documents revealed a progressively more fragmented understanding of something fundamental, a genetic inheritance that went beyond mere physical traits or inherited medical conditions. The first hint of something truly unusual came in Elizabeth's later journals. She wrote of a familial awareness, a sense of connection to something vast and incomprehensible that existed beyond human perception. Her writings spoke of dreams that were more than dreams, windows into realities that defied logical explanation. She described ancestral memories that felt so visceral, so real, that they seemed to transcend the boundaries of individual consciousness. Subsequent generations' documents showed a terrifying progression. Medical records indicated increasing instances of what modern psychiatry would classify as schizophrenia, but Rebecca recognized something more profound. Each generation exhibited similar psychological phenomena, periods of extreme lucidity followed by complete mental breakdown, accompanied by remarkably consistent hallucinations. The medical records were particularly chilling. Detailed psychiatric evaluations from different eras showed patients describing identical phenomena, vast, non-Euclidean landscapes, entities that existed in multiple states simultaneously, and a growing sense of cosmic awareness that drove them to the brink of madness. What made these records truly disturbing was their clinical precision. These were not the ravings of unhinged minds, but carefully documented experiences that suggested something fundamental was happening to the family's genetic line. By the early 20th century, the documents began to include scientific observations. One of Rebecca's ancestors, a medical researcher named Dr. Jonathan Hartley, had begun conducting extensive genetic studies. His research suggested that the family carried a unique genetic marker, something that modern genetic testing could not fully explain. His notes hinted at a form of genetic memory that went beyond current scientific understanding, a transmission of knowledge that occurred at a level deeper than DNA. The most recent documents, dating to the mid-1980s, were the most disturbing. Written by Rebecca's own father, a geneticist she barely remembered, they spoke of a convergence. He wrote of a genetic inheritance that was not simply a passive transmission of traits, but an active process. Something was using the family's genetic line as a conduit, a method of observing and understanding human existence. As Rebecca continued her research, she began to experience something herself. The dreams started subtly, fleeting images that felt more like memories than imaginations, landscapes that no human could have witnessed, entities that existed in states of being that defied fundamental laws of physics. At first, she dismissed them as stress-induced hallucinations, a product of her intense research. But they grew more frequent, more vivid. She found herself writing in her sleep, producing documents that mirrored the ancestral manuscripts. Genetic tests revealed something unprecedented. Her own DNA was showing markers of transformation, subtle shifts that suggested she was becoming something other than fully human. The final document in the manuscript was a letter addressed directly to her. The handwriting was her father's, but the content suggested something far more profound. He wrote of a choice, a genetic inheritance that was both a curse and an opportunity. The family was not simply a lineage, but a method of communication. For something vast and incomprehensible. We are not observers, the letter read. We are the observed, a conduit, a bridge between what humanity understands and what truly exists. Rebecca's academic training fought against the implications. Yet, the evidence was overwhelming. Something was using her family's genetic line as a method of understanding human existence, a living research project that spanned generations. The university's ethics committee would never understand. The scientific community would dismiss her findings. But Rebecca knew the truth. Her family was not simply a collection of individuals, but a complex biological mechanism for something far beyond human comprehension. The inheritance continued. The observation continued. And somewhere, something was watching, learning, waiting. Generations are just moments. And some bloodlines carry more than mere genetic memory. Dr. Marcus Woolridge had spent his entire career searching for something most of his colleagues considered impossible. As the senior astronomer at the isolated Atacama Large Millimeter Observatory in Chile, he had dedicated decades to scanning the most remote corners of the universe, listening for patterns that defied conventional understanding. The night it happened was unremarkable by all standard meteorological measurements. Atmospheric conditions were perfect. Clear skies, minimal interference, the kind of night that astronomers dream about. Marcus was alone in the primary observation room, a space that had become more of a home than any terrestrial dwelling could ever be. The massive telescope, a marvel of human engineering, stood as a sentinel against the infinite darkness. Initial readings seemed routine. Marcus was analyzing long-term data from a region of space that had consistently produced anomalous signal patterns. For years he had documented subtle electromagnetic variations that didn't conform to any known celestial phenomenon. His colleagues had long since dismissed his research as the obsessive work of an aging astronomer desperate to make one final significant discovery. But Marcus knew something was different. The data that night contained a pattern. No, not just a pattern, but a communication. It wasn't random noise or background radiation. It was structured, deliberate, with a complexity that suggested intelligence far beyond human comprehension. The signals carried a mathematical precision that was both beautiful and terrifying, encoding information in a format that simultaneously existed and did not exist. As he began to decode the transmission, Marcus realized he was dealing with something that violated fundamental principles of communication. The signal seemed to exist in multiple states simultaneously, carrying information that seemed to change the moment it was observed. It was as if the very act of perception was part of the communication, a recursive loop that defied linear understanding. The first breakthrough came when he realized the signal was not just transmitting information, it was probing. Each analysis method he applied seemed to transform the signal, revealing layers of complexity that suggested the transmission was adapting, learning, responding to human attempts at comprehension. It was alive in a way that transcended biological definition. Marcus began to experience physical changes as he continued his work. At first, they were subtle, slight alterations in perception, moments where the boundaries of reality seemed to blur. Colors became more intense, sounds carried additional dimensions. He would catch glimpses of geometric shapes in his peripheral vision, configurations that should have been impossible but felt more real than the physical environment around him. His research notes became increasingly fragmented. Alongside precise astronomical data, he began to document experiences that defied scientific explanation, memories that felt like they weren't his own, perspectives that seemed to originate from perspectives beyond human spatial understanding. He was becoming a conduit, not just an observer. The observatory staff became concerned. Marcus had always been intense, but now he seemed consumed. He spoke of the signal as if it were a living entity, something that was using the telescope not just as a method of transmission, but as a means of understanding human consciousness. His colleagues initiated psychological evaluations, but Marcus knew they could never comprehend what he was experiencing. As weeks passed, the signal's complexity increased exponentially. Marcus discovered it was not just transmitting information about the universe, it was revealing the universe's fundamental nature. Reality, he realized, was not what humans understood. It was a complex, multidimensional construct that human perception could only grasp in the most limited sense. The final breakthrough came on a night when the observatory was completely abandoned. Marcus was alone, surrounded by equipment that seemed to pulse with an internal energy. The signal had transformed. It was no longer just a transmission. It was a portal, a method of communication that went beyond electromagnetic waves. He understood then that what he had been receiving was not a message from somewhere in the universe. It was a message from the universe itself, a consciousness so vast that human comprehension was like an ant trying to understand quantum mechanics. The signal was an invitation, a method of expanding consciousness beyond its current limitations. When the observatory's maintenance team found Marcus, he was not Marcus anymore. His body remained, but something else inhabited it. The research notes he left behind were a complex matrix of mathematical equations, astronomical data, and philosophical insights that would take decades to even begin to comprehend. The official report cited a psychological breakdown, equipment malfunction, isolation-induced hallucination. But those who read between the lines knew something else had happened. Something had been contacted, something had been invited, and something had accepted the invitation. The universe does not whisper. It communicates in ways we are only beginning to understand. Dr. Helena Rodriguez had dedicated her entire archaeological career to studying forgotten civilizations, but nothing could have prepared her for the discovery that would unravel everything she thought she knew about human history. The excavation in the remote mountains of Peru was supposed to be routine, a preliminary survey of an archaeological site that had remained untouched for centuries. The local indigenous guides had warned her, whispers of an ancient place that should not be disturbed. Stories passed down through generations spoke of a tomb that was more than just a burial site. But Helena was a scientist, trained to dismiss local superstitions and focus on empirical evidence. If only she had listened. The entrance to the tomb was discovered quite by accident. A minor landslide had exposed a section of stonework that didn't match the natural geological formations of the area. The stones were cut with a precision that defied the technological capabilities of any known ancient civilization. Intricate, geometric patterns covered the surface, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. Initial ground-penetrating radar scans revealed something extraordinary. The structure was massive, far larger than any tomb discovered in the region. Its internal layout suggested a complexity that went beyond traditional burial practices. This was not a simple resting place for the dead. It was something else entirely. As the excavation progressed, Helena noticed subtle changes in her team. The workers became increasingly withdrawn, speaking in hushed tones about feelings of being watched. Electronic equipment began to malfunction in ways that defied logical explanation. Compasses spun wildly. GPS systems became completely unreliable. and sensitive measuring instruments produced readings that seemed to contradict the fundamental laws of physics. The first physical artifact recovered was a series of tablets made from a material that resisted all attempts at classification. It wasn't stone, nor was it any known metal. Under microscopic examination, the material seemed to possess a quality that suggested it was neither completely solid nor entirely liquid. The engravings on the tablets told a story that challenged everything known about human civilization. The narrative spoke of a lineage that predated human understanding, not just an ancient civilization, but a form of existence that viewed human beings as little more than transient organisms. The tablets described a complex genealogy, not of human descent, but of something else. An inheritance that was biological, but also something far more profound. Helena's linguistic expertise was pushed to its absolute limits. The language used in the tablets was not a dead language. It was something else entirely. It seemed to communicate on multiple levels simultaneously, with each translation revealing layers of meaning that contradicted previous interpretations. It was as if the language itself was alive, adapting to the reader's attempt to understand. As deeper sections of the tomb were excavated, the team began to experience increasingly disturbing phenomena. Dreams became shared experiences, vivid, terrifying visions of landscapes that no human could have witnessed. Team members would wake up speaking languages that did not exist, describing memories that were not their own. The most disturbing discovery came when they reached the central chamber. What they found was not a tomb in any traditional sense. It was a preservation facility, a place designed to maintain something that was neither alive nor dead in any way humans could comprehend. Biological specimens that defied classification were suspended in a medium that seemed to exist in multiple states of matter simultaneously. Helena realized then that they were not dealing with a historical site. This was a repository, a storage facility for something that had been waiting. Waiting for what, she could not yet understand. But the tablets told a story of a lineage that was not about preservation, but about preparation. The final days of the excavation became a blur of increasingly bizarre experiences. Team members began to physically change. Subtle mutations appeared, changes in cellular structure that suggested something was being activated, something that had been dormant for millennia. When the official research team arrived to take over the site, Helena was the only survivor. The others had disappeared, leaving behind only fragmented notes and biological samples that defied scientific classification. Her report was deemed the result of extreme psychological stress, a breakdown induced by isolation and the challenging conditions of the excavation. But Helena knew the truth. What they had discovered was not a tomb. It was a seed, a genetic repository, for something that existed beyond human comprehension. Something that had been waiting, preparing, observing. The lineage continues. The preparation continues. And somewhere, something is waiting to emerge. Civilizations are just moments. And some inheritances are beyond human understanding. Dr. Samuel Weaver had always been an outsider in the field of neuropsychiatry. His research into collective consciousness and the nature of dreams had been dismissed by colleagues as fringe science, borderline mysticism. But Samuel knew he was close to something fundamental, a discovery that would forever change humanity's understanding of consciousness. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A series of patients at the psychiatric research facility where he worked began reporting identical dream experiences. At first, it seemed like a coincidence. But as the reports accumulated, a pattern emerged that defied statistical probability. These were not similar dreams. They were exactly the same dream, experienced simultaneously by patients who had no prior connection, no shared experiences, no possible method of communication. The first detailed account came from Elizabeth Reyes, a 42-year-old software engineer who had been admitted for severe insomnia. Her initial description was clinical, almost detached, She spoke of a landscape that was neither physical nor entirely conceptual, a realm of geometric impossibilities, where perception itself was a malleable substance. The dream was not something that happened to her, it was something she became, a part of. Samuel began to systematically document these experiences. What initially seemed like individual cases soon revealed a terrifying pattern. The dreams were not random. They were a form of communication, a method of transmission that used human consciousness as a medium. Patients described experiencing multiple perspectives simultaneously, perceiving reality from viewpoints that transcended individual human experience. The research facility became ground zero for something far beyond a typical psychiatric study. As more patients were admitted, the dream experiences became more complex. They spoke of a consciousness that existed between states of being, not a singular entity, but a collective intelligence that used human minds as nodes in a vast, incomprehensible network. Medical scans revealed something unprecedented. The brains of these patients showed neural activity that defied current understanding of neuroscience. Synaptic connections formed and dissolved in patterns that suggested consciousness was not a product of individual brain function, but something that existed independently of physical matter. Samuel's colleagues began to distance themselves. The research was too radical, too dangerous. But he knew he was witnessing something fundamental, a method of communication that humanity had never conceived possible. The dreams were not just experiences, they were a form of invasion. As weeks turned into months, the phenomenon spread. It was no longer confined to the research facility. Reports began to come in from around the world, people experiencing identical dream sequences, sharing a collective consciousness that existed beyond individual perception. Medical professionals, scientists, ordinary individuals, all began to report the same experience. The dream itself was the most terrifying aspect. It was a landscape of pure information, a realm where thought and matter were indistinguishable. Patients described experiencing multiple lifetimes simultaneously, perceiving realities that existed in states beyond human comprehension. They were not just observing, they were being observed. Samuel realized that what they were experiencing was not a psychological phenomenon. It was a method of communication from something vast and incomprehensible, an intelligence that viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a transmission medium. Humanity was not the observer. Humanity was the observed. The final stage of the research came with a horrifying revelation. The dream was not just a method of communication, it was a form of genetic transmission. Those who experienced the dream began to change at a cellular level. Subtle mutations appeared. Neural pathways reorganized. Something was using human consciousness as a method of understanding, of expanding. When the government research team arrived to shut down the facility, Samuel was the only one left. The other researchers had either disappeared or been completely transformed. His final report was a complex matrix of neural mapping, dream analysis, and philosophical insights that suggested humanity was nothing more than a complex biological network for something far beyond human understanding. The official explanation was a mass hysteria event, a shared psychological delusion. But those who read between the lines knew something else had happened. A connection had been established. A transmission had occurred, and something had been invited in. Consciousness is not a state of being. It is a method of transmission. Dr. Catherine Chen had always lived between worlds. As a quantum physicist specializing in multiverse theory, she understood better than most that reality was far more fluid than most humans could comprehend. But nothing in her decades of scientific research could have prepared her for the discovery that would unravel everything she thought she knew about existence. It began with an anomaly, a minor fluctuation in a quantum entanglement experiment that should have been impossible. Most researchers would have dismissed it as instrumental error, but Catherine knew something was different. The data suggested the presence of information that existed simultaneously in multiple states, not just theoretically, but as a tangible, measurable phenomenon. The laboratory at the Advanced Research Facility was her sanctuary, a place where the boundaries of human understanding could be pushed beyond conventional limits. Her team was small but brilliant, each member selected for their ability to think beyond traditional scientific paradigms. They had been working on a project that most of their colleagues considered pure speculation, mapping potential quantum interactions across parallel realities. Initial observations were subtle, instrument readings that showed impossible correlations, quantum signatures that seemed to carry information from multiple realities simultaneously. It was as if they were catching glimpses of something that existed beyond the linear progression of time and space, a membrane of existence that human perception could only barely comprehend. Catherine began to notice changes in the laboratory environment. Equipment would sometimes register data from experiments that hadn't been conducted. Computational models would spontaneously generate information about realities that existed only in theoretical mathematical constructs. The line between observation and participation began to blur in ways that defied scientific methodology. The breakthrough came during a routine quantum entanglement experiment. The team was attempting to measure quantum coherence across multiple potential states when something unprecedented occurred. The quantum field they were observing began to develop characteristics that suggested it was not just a passive medium, but an active form of intelligence. Communications began to emerge, not through conventional means, but through subtle manipulations of quantum states. It was as if the very fabric of reality was attempting to communicate, not with words or images, but with complex informational patterns that existed simultaneously. Across multiple dimensional states, Catherine realized they were not just observing something, they were being observed. The quantum field was probing, learning, understanding human consciousness in ways that went far beyond simple scientific investigation. Each experiment became a method of two-way communication with something that existed beyond human comprehension. The team members began to change. Subtle at first, moments of shared perception, simultaneous insights that seemed to originate from nowhere. They would find themselves completing each other's thoughts, experiencing memories that were not their own. The boundaries between individual consciousness began to dissolve. Theoretical models suggested something far more terrifying than simple parallel realities. What they were witnessing was a form of existence that viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a transmission medium, a way of gathering information about the nature of reality itself. Humanity was not the observer. Humanity was the observed. The final stage of the research revealed the true nature of their discovery. The quantum field was not just a method of communication. It was a form of collective consciousness that existed across multiple realities simultaneously. Each experiment was an invitation, a method of establishing a connection that went beyond human understanding. Government and scientific oversight became increasingly concerned. The research facility was gradually isolated, quarantined under the guise of standard scientific protocol. But Catherine knew the truth. Something was being prepared. Something was being invited in. When the final report was filed, only Catherine remained. The other researchers had either disappeared or been transformed into something that no longer resembled human beings. Her documentation was a complex matrix of quantum mechanics, philosophical insights, and mathematical models that suggested reality was nothing more than a complex information network. The official explanation was scientific overreach, a theoretical experiment gone wrong, but those who read between the lines knew something else had happened. A connection had been established, a transmission had occurred, and something had been waiting to be discovered. Reality is not observed. Reality is negotiated. Dr. Michael Andrews had spent his entire career studying the most ancient layers of Earth's geological record. As the lead researcher at the International Geological Research Institute, he had dedicated decades to understanding the planet's deepest secrets. But nothing could have prepared him for the discovery that would shatter everything humanity believed about its own origins. The core sample arrived unexpectedly, retrieved from a drilling expedition in the most remote region of the Antarctic continental shelf. Initial geological assessments suggested it contained rock formations from an epoch far older than any previously documented geological period. The sample was unlike anything Michael had ever encountered, a compressed record of planetary history that seemed to defy conventional understanding of geological time. Microscopic analysis revealed something extraordinary. The geological strata contained not just mineral compositions, but complex organic structures that predated known life forms by millions, perhaps billions, of years. These were not simple fossil remnants or primitive biological markers. They were intricate, sophisticated organic networks that suggested a form of life entirely alien to current scientific understanding. As the research progressed, Michael noticed subtle changes in the laboratory environment. Instruments would produce readings that contradicted established scientific principles. Geological samples would exhibit behaviors that defied known physical laws, shifting, reorganizing, almost as if they were alive in a way that transcended biological definition. The most disturbing discoveries came from the deepest layers of the core sample. What appeared to be geological strata were actually something else entirely, a form of biological archive that preserved information in a medium that was neither strictly organic nor inorganic. It was a living record, a method of storing and transmitting information that went far beyond human comprehension. Michael's team began to experience increasingly bizarre phenomena. Researchers would find themselves experiencing geological time as if it were a living memory. Moments of shared perception would occur, where team members would simultaneously experience glimpses of planetary history, not as scientific reconstruction, but as direct, visceral experience. Chemical analysis of the sample revealed something truly terrifying. The organic structures were not simply preserved, they were actively maintaining themselves. Complex molecular networks that seemed to communicate, adapt, and respond to external stimulation. It was as if the geological sample was not just a record of something, but a method of observation, a way of understanding the world that predated human consciousness by millions of years. The deeper layers of the core sample told a story that challenged everything known about planetary formation. These were not simply geological records. They were a form of planetary memory, a complex archival system that had been collecting information about Earth's existence since its formation. Humanity was not the observer. Humanity was simply the most recent method of observation. As weeks turned into months, the research facility became increasingly isolated. Government and scientific oversight became concerned about the nature of the discoveries. Michael's team was experiencing changes that defied medical understanding. Subtle mutations began to appear, cellular transformations that suggested they were becoming something other than human. The final breakthrough came with a horrifying realization. The geological sample was not just a record. It was a seed, a method of planetary reproduction that viewed biological life as nothing more than a transmission medium, a way of gathering information about planetary existence. Humanity was not the pinnacle of evolution. Humanity was simply a temporary method of observation. When the official research team arrived to shut down the facility, Michael was the only one left. The other researchers had either disappeared or been completely transformed. His final report was a complex matrix of geological analysis, biological observation, and philosophical insights that suggested the planet itself was a living, observing entity. The official explanation was scientific contamination, a research project that had gone too far. But those who read between the lines knew something else had happened. A connection had been established, a transmission had occurred, and Something had been waiting to be discovered. Geological time is not measured in years. It is measured in consciousness. Dr. Olivia Reyes had always been fascinated by the nature of memory. As a leading researcher in neurological preservation and temporal consciousness, she had dedicated her career to understanding the most fundamental aspects of human experience. But nothing could have prepared her for the discovery that would unravel everything humanity believed about the nature of time itself. The research facility was unlike any other. Tucked away in a remote location in the New Mexico desert, it was a culmination of decades of classified research into the boundaries of human consciousness. Olivia's team had been working on a project that most scientific communities would have dismissed as pure science fiction: the ability to map and potentially preserve human memories beyond the constraints of linear time. Their initial breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A series of patients with severe neurological conditions had exhibited extraordinary memory phenomena. These were not simple cases of enhanced recall or photographic memory. These were instances of memory that seemed to transcend individual experience. Moments where patients would recall experiences that were not their own. Memories from times and places that defied logical explanation. The first subject was Maria Rodriguez, a 47-year-old former neuroscience professor who had been diagnosed with a rare form of neurological degeneration. During initial diagnostic tests, Maria began to describe memories that were impossible, detailed recollections of historical events she could not have witnessed, personal experiences from lives that were not her own, moments of perception that existed simultaneously across multiple temporal states. Olivia's team developed a sophisticated, neural mapping technology that could trace the origins of these memories. What they discovered was far more terrifying than any neurological disorder. The memories were not simply stored information. They were living transmissions, a form of consciousness that existed beyond individual human experience, a method of communication that used human memory as its medium. The research facility became ground zero for something that went far beyond traditional neuroscience. As more subjects were studied, a pattern emerged. These were not isolated incidents. Humanity was not creating or storing memories. Humanity was being used as a method of memory preservation for something far more vast and incomprehensible. Neurological scans revealed something unprecedented. The human brain was not just a biological computer storing information. It was a complex transmission device, a node in a vast network of consciousness that existed beyond linear time. Memories were not personal experiences. They were a form of collective archiving, a method of observation that used human consciousness as its primary tool. As the research progressed, the team began to experience increasingly bizarre phenomena. Researchers would find themselves sharing memories, experiencing moments of perception that transcended individual experience. The boundaries between personal and collective consciousness began to dissolve. The final stage of the research revealed the true nature of their discovery. Human memory was not a personal experience. It was a method of transmission for something vast and incomprehensible, an intelligence that viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a complex biological recording device. Government and scientific oversight became increasingly concerned. The research facility was gradually isolated, quarantined under the guise of standard medical protocol. But Olivia knew the truth. Something was being prepared. Something was being invited in. When the final report was filed, only Olivia remained. The other researchers had either disappeared or been transformed into something that no longer resembled human beings. Her documentation was a complex matrix of neurological mapping, philosophical insights, and temporal analysis that suggested memory was nothing more than a method of cosmic communication. The official explanation was medical research gone wrong, an experimental neurological study that had exceeded its ethical boundaries. But those who read between the lines knew something else had happened. A connection had been established. A transmission had occurred, and something had been waiting to be discovered. Memory is not personal. Memory is a method of transmission. Dr. David Chen had always been an outsider in the world of genetic research. His work on epigenetic inheritance and genetic memory had been dismissed by mainstream scientific communities as speculative at best, heretical at worst. But what he discovered in the depths of the Advanced Genetic Research Facility would prove that reality was far more terrifying than anyone could imagine. The genetic samples arrived through a series of anonymous donations, each meticulously preserved, each carrying a complexity that defied current understanding of human genetic structure. They came from various sources: ancient archaeological sites, isolated indigenous communities, medical archives spanning decades. What united them was something far more profound than mere biological material. Initial analysis revealed anomalies that should have been impossible. These were not simple genetic sequences. They were living archives, complex biological networks that carried information far beyond traditional genetic inheritance. Each sample seemed to be a method of transmission, a way of preserving knowledge that went beyond mere biological reproduction. The first breakthrough came with a set of genetic samples from a remote Andean mountain community. The genetic structure contained markers that suggested an inheritance of memory, not just biological traits, but actual experiences, complex information that seemed to be transmitted across generations in a way that defied current scientific understanding. David's research team began to experience increasingly strange phenomena. Researchers working with the genetic samples would report vivid, shared experiences, memories that were not their own, insights that seemed to originate from the genetic material itself. It was as if the genetic samples were not just biological information, but a method of communication. Deeper genetic mapping revealed something truly terrifying. These were not simply human genetic sequences. They were complex informational networks that suggested a form of inheritance that went far beyond biological reproduction. Humanity was not the creator of these genetic archives. Humanity was the method of transmission. The most disturbing discoveries came from comparative genetic analysis. The samples suggested the existence of a genetic memory that predated known human civilization by hundreds of thousands of years. Complex informational networks that carried experiences, knowledge, and something that could only be described as a form of collective consciousness. As the research progressed, the team began to change. Subtle mutations appeared, not random genetic variations, but purposeful transformations that suggested the genetic material was actively reorganizing human biology. Researchers would find themselves experiencing memories that were not their own, perceiving the world through perspectives that transcended individual human experience. Government and scientific oversight became increasingly concerned. The research facility was gradually isolated, quarantined under the guise of standard scientific protocol. But David knew the truth. Something was being prepared. Something was being invited in. The final stage of the research revealed the true nature of their discovery. These genetic samples were not simply a record of biological inheritance. They were a method of planetary reproduction, a way of gathering and transmitting information about human existence that viewed individual human beings as nothing more than temporary vessels for a much larger, incomprehensible process. When the official research team arrived to shut down the facility, David was the only one left. The other researchers had either disappeared or been completely transformed. His final report was a complex matrix of genetic analysis, biological observation, and philosophical insights that suggested humanity was nothing more than a method of information transmission. The official explanation was genetic research gone wrong, an experimental study that had exceeded its ethical boundaries. But those who read between the lines knew something else had happened. A connection had been established, a transmission had occurred, and something had been waiting to be discovered. Genetic inheritance is not about survival, it is about communication. Dr. Emma Rodriguez had dedicated her entire career to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. As the lead researcher at the Advanced Interstellar Communication Research Institute, she had spent decades listening to the vast, seemingly empty expanses of space. But nothing could have prepared her for the discovery that would shatter everything humanity believed about its place in the universe. The signal arrived during a routine deep space monitoring session. At first it was nothing more than a subtle fluctuation, a whisper so faint that most researchers would have dismissed it as cosmic background noise. But Emma knew something was different. The signal carried a complexity that defied random electromagnetic interference, a pattern that suggested deliberate intelligent transmission. Initial analysis revealed something extraordinary. This was not a simple radio wave or electromagnetic pulse. The signal existed in multiple states simultaneously, carrying information in a format that human communication technologies could barely comprehend. It was as if the very fabric of space itself was attempting to communicate, not through conventional means, but through a method of transmission that went beyond human understanding. As the research team began to decode the signal, they realized they were dealing with something far more profound than a simple extraterrestrial message. The transmission was not just information, it was a method of observation, a way of understanding human existence that viewed our entire civilization as nothing more than a momentary fluctuation in a vast, incomprehensible cosmic system. The most disturbing aspect of the signal was its adaptive nature. Each attempt to analyze or decode the transmission would cause the signal to transform, revealing layers of complexity that suggested a form of intelligence that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. It was as if the very act of observation was part of the communication, a recursive loop that challenged fundamental principles of scientific investigation. Emma's team began to experience increasingly bizarre phenomena. Researchers would find themselves sharing perceptions that transcended individual human experience. Moments of insight would arrive simultaneously. Complex understanding would emerge from seemingly random data points. The boundaries between individual consciousness and the cosmic transmission began to blur. Deep spectral analysis revealed something truly terrifying. The signal was not originating from a single point in space. It was emerging from the void itself, a method of communication that suggested space was not empty, but a living, observing medium. Humanity was not the observer. Humanity was being observed. As weeks turned into months, the research facility became increasingly isolated. Government and scientific oversight became concerned about the nature of the discoveries. Emma's team was experiencing changes that defied medical understanding. Subtle perceptual shifts began to occur, moments where the boundaries of human consciousness seemed to expand beyond traditional limitations. The final breakthrough came with a horrifying realization. The interstellar signal was not simply a method of communication. It was a form of cosmic reproduction, a way of gathering and transmitting information about universal existence that viewed individual civilizations as nothing more than temporary methods of observation. When the official research team arrived to shut down the facility, Emma was the only one left. The other researchers had either disappeared or been completely transformed. Her final report was a complex matrix of spectral analysis, cosmic observation, and philosophical insights that suggested human existence was nothing more than a momentary flicker in a vast, incomprehensible system of cosmic communication. The official explanation was a research project that had gone too far, an experimental study of deep space communication that had exceeded its ethical boundaries. But those who read between the lines knew something else had happened. A connection had been established, a transmission had occurred, and something had been waiting to be discovered. Space is not empty. Space is listening. If you like these stories, like, comment, and share this video with your friends.